Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. I'm Alan Abbey, Media Director of the Institute. Today's program is part of our annual David Hartman Memorial Conference for Jewish Democratic Israel. I'll introduce our two distinguished speakers in just a second. I want to welcome everybody watching online on the Hartman website and Facebook, and a special welcome to those watching on the Jerusalem Post website. We also have a large in-house audience with us today. Our speakers need no introductions, but they deserve them. So, from New York, we have Yehuda Kurtzer. Yehuda Kurtzer is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Yehuda is a prominent author, speaker, educator, commentator, and writer. He is the author of Shuva, The Future of the Jewish Past. Alongside me here in Jerusalem is Micah Goodman. Micah is a Hartman Institute Research Fellow and teaches at Beit Midrash Yisraeli Ein Prat. Micah's latest book in English is Catch 67, The Left, the Right, and the Legacy of the Six-Day War. Yehuda and Micah are here today to discuss nationalism, marginalization, and Jewish peoplehood. They will address questions such as, are the recent nationalist revivals in Israel and the United States marginalizing American Jewry and harming its relationship with the Jewish state? And how are Israelis perceiving and responding to the rise of nationalism in the U.S. and beyond? After their talks, we hope to have time for questions from the audience, both online and here in our room. If you're watching online, you can post your questions on our Facebook page or email them to me on the link on the page where you're watching that. And for those in the room, we have a microphone set up on the side, and we'll be taking questions at that point. So from now without any further delay, from New York, Shalom Hartman Institute of North America President Yehuda Kurtzer.
Hi, everyone in Jerusalem and online. Hope you can hear me okay. Yes? Great. First of all, it's an honor to be here with you. I'm sorry I'm not in Jerusalem, but I'm excited to be in conversation with my colleague, with Micah, who I'm always grateful to be in dialogue with. Thank you to Alan, and I want to thank the whole team at the Machon in Israel under leadership of Mick Weinstein for their hard work in putting together this important conference. I also just want to acknowledge at the outset, the phrase chaval da'avdin, a sense of loss of what we're missing. I think many of us feel a deep need for courageous moral leadership in the world right now. I think many of us feel the loss of voices like David Hartman's as something that's missing. And I hope that today's conference and the work that we're doing around these issues serves as a tribute to the founder of the Shalom Hartman Institute. What I want to offer today is what I hope is going to be a challenging thesis for us to play with, a suggestive idea that I'm going to ask then, Micha, for you to push back, reject, maybe even accept. And the thesis is as follows. Right now, it seems to me that Jewish nationalism is effectively at war with and at odds with Jewish peoplehood. And it's a little bit of a strange dichotomy to make between nationalism and peoplehood for reasons that I'll expand. And generally speaking, when we imagine the relationship between Israel and world Jewry, it's easier to paint a dichotomy that Israel represents nationalism and diaspora Jewry represents globalization, or that Israel represents political realism and diaspora Jews represent a kind of utopianism. Those are easy and clean dichotomies that make it very easy to parody the diaspora Jew for not having a realistic sensibility of what it means to be in the world. And it makes it easy to caricature and even turn into a kind of anti-Semitic caricature, the Jew as the ultimate globalist. And even when you create the dichotomy in that way between the nationalist and the globalist, part of the goal is to then create a kind of neat Hegelian synthesis that ideally the Jewish people live somewhere between these two trends. But I actually think, and I want to make a more pressing argument, that the core tension is between Jewish nationalism and Jewish peoplehood. And in particular, Israeli nationalism, which sometimes calls itself Zionism, is increasingly in tension with American Jewish peoplehood, which also sometimes calls itself Zionism. Now, what makes this tricky is that obviously nationalism and peoplehood share a history and a point of origin. They sometimes seem like they're synonyms for each other. The idea of Jewish peoplehood, that there is such a thing as a Jewish people, and that what it means to be a Jew is to be in relationship to that people, originates a long time ago, somewhere between Genesis 12, when God tells Abraham, I'll make you a great nation, and perhaps Exodus 1, which is the first time when the Israelites are described as Am B'nai Israel, not by themselves, the nation of the people of Israel, not as I was trying to say, nationalism and peoplehood seem to me to have maybe an original point of origin, but the current way in which we use the term Jewish peoplehood seems to have a more recent history. A number of historians, including Noam Pianko at the University of Washington, describe the birth of Jewish peoplehood as an idea, that is, that the core commitment to the Jewish people is to the people itself, as originating in 1950s American Jewry, as a way for American Jews to describe their support for the project of Zionism without having to talk about it as being nationalism. And the very clear reasons why they needed to do that was that American Jews' political position was far more precarious in the 1950s, and therefore ran some risk of a sense of dual loyalty, and felt that if they talked about themselves as Jewish nationalists while trying to preserve their position in America, it would compromise that political position. So Jewish peoplehood becomes a critical feature of how American Jews talk about their Zionism. In the early days of Zionism, and certainly in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there are all sorts of reasons why commitments to nationalism and commitments to Jewish peoplehood are functionally identical and serving one another. It's not to say that there aren't problematics. The question of what's good for the nation state and what's good for the Jewish people sometimes do run against each other. Mati Friedman, in his new book, Spies of No Nation, talks about what it meant for early Israeli spies to represent the Jewish state in communities where there were still diaspora Jews, including in the Middle East. And the great kind of myth of early Israeli espionage was the question of, if an Israeli spy comes across an angry mob beating up a Jew, their instructions were to join in with the mob. In other words, there's an open question as the Jewish nation state comes into being of the ways in which Zionism is good for the whole Jewish people, but is oftentimes not necessarily good for individual Jews. And the great paradox of Zionism as relates to diaspora, that Zionism is bringing about a political reality that is going to be ultimately good for the broader Jewish people, but it does compromise the position of diaspora Jews worldwide. At the time, though, in the early state, the Jewish people need a nation state. They need a political form of nationalism. And so the state winds up being in the interest of the Jewish people, that is, in the interest of Jewish peoplehood, and the interest of nationalism. Or put differently, the destiny of the Jewish people following the Holocaust is so critical in the form of a nation state that support for that state is de facto support for all of the fate of Jews worldwide, and the collective destiny of the Jewish people is tied into that state. And I think you could argue for a lot of the 20th century that this was true for American Jews as well. If you can find a way to support the project of Jewish nationalism, then I can be a peoplehood Jew in relationship to Jewish nationalism. And it not only doesn't compromise my position as an American Jew, but in some ways it reinforces it. This goes back to Louis Brandeis, but it really finds its fullest articulation in the Six-Day War. The transformation of American Jewry that happens as a result of the Six-Day War is not that American Jews en masse make Aliyah, it's actually that they become stronger citizens of America. They run for office more, they become more publicly visible, more comfortable displaying their sense of confidence in the world. So until roughly the Six-Day War, maybe a little afterwards, the commitment of American Jews to Jewish peoplehood and the commitment of Israel to the nationalism that results in a nation state are feeding each other and supporting each other. It's no longer clear that that calculus still holds, and that the choices that Israel needs or wants to make in its national interests are ultimately good for the Jewish people anywhere outside of the state of Israel. And I think one of the key examples to this effect is Israel's alliances with ultra-nationalist regimes in Hungary, in the United States, where I think many diaspora Jews, myself included, wonder whether the activities that a state would do to ensure its long-term safety and survival are actually maybe endangering world Jewry with those choices. The rise of nationalism in Europe and in the United States that is supported by the government of the State of Israel only makes sense as being good for world Jewry through a self-referential argument that whatever is good for the Jewish state is good for all of the Jewish people. And even if that's true with respect to Israel's safety and survival, it's self-evidently not true with respect to the moral character of the Jewish people. So nationalism taken to its extreme winds up producing this weird and deep tension with other Jews' commitment to safety and survival of Jewish peoplehood. I want to make two other connected arguments. One is the question of what do American Jews and Israeli Jews expect of one another within a framework of peoplehood. And here, once again, the demands of nationalism sometimes are too much and run counter to the demands of peoplehood. In a nationalism construct, demands and obligations are entirely one-directional. The question for diaspora Jews is, what must I do to support the national project of the State of Israel? A peoplehood demand would say, in what ways are you obligated to me, and in what ways am I obligated to you? And I'll give you a crude case study. Many Israelis would argue that the responsibility of American Jews during the negotiations leading up to the Iran deal was to listen carefully to the majority of Israeli Jews who were opposed to the Iran deal, and to therefore be opposed to it, regardless of what they thought in terms of its validity for America. But out of a sense of Jewish peoplehood, American Jews should have been opposed to the deal. But when you ask the reverse question of Israeli Jews, the overwhelming majority of American Jews believe that the present administration is a threat to the Jewish position in America. You don't get a reciprocal response. Israelis, by and large, embrace the current administration because they think it's good for the State of Israel. So what's good for the State of Israel dictates how American Jews should act vis-a-vis their own country, and what's good for the State of Israel dictates how American Jews should act vis-a-vis Israel. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of deep reciprocity. If the only thing that is the defining interest of what's good for the Jewish people can be located in a nation state, then Jewish peoplehood has given way to Jewish nationalism, and I think that's a pretty deep loss. But the biggest issue, and I think the real struggle, and something that I think our institute has something to teach about, is that peoplehood, by definition, is supposed to incorporate aspects of the moral character of the Jewish nation, and nationalism doesn't. Nationalism, almost by definition, evacuates peoplehood of religious meaning. It enshrines the state, the political form of Jewish peoplehood, as its most authentic expression, and it substitutes security for substance. The main nafkamina, so to speak, to use a Talmudic term, that differentiates between nationalism and peoplehood is the phrase realpolitik. A nation state has to live by realpolitik, and I don't oftentimes judge the choices that a nation state in the Middle East has to exercise as part of that calculus. But when realpolitik becomes the dominant discourse of a nation state, it is going to start looking a lot less like Jewish peoplehood. Now, you can't simultaneously say that peoplehood has been core to Jewish tradition since Abraham, and then insist that the contemporary expression of Jewish peoplehood in the form of nationalism excises covenant and the moral character of the Jewish people, excises the idea that we're all responsible for one another, regardless of where we live, and concentrate entirely on the teleology of the political state in the homeland as the only expression of Jewish peoplehood in nationalism. A serious Jew, recognizing the legacy of David Hartman, I think should be caught exactly in this place. I acknowledge that the nation state makes something possible that's extraordinary for the Jewish people, but apropos Hartman's writings, we're never supposed to enshrine the nation state beyond its instrumental purpose for the Jewish people. And our job is to hold it accountable to the larger visions of what Jewish peoplehood is supposed to bring to the world. The distortion of peoplehood, meanwhile, into a kind of nationalism that insists on a grotesque realpolitik is basically its moral undoing. And in this context, I think it just asks too much of the Jewish people. And I know this is kind of a slam dunk, but the whole Otzma Yehudit story is kind of is the perfect case study. The extent to which a nation state thinks that its realpolitik choices allow it to forego the entire moral character of its commitments makes me reluctant to now claim that the Zionist expression of Jewish peoplehood in the form of nationalism is any way identical to the American Jewish or global Jewish commitment to Jewish peoplehood, which can still be Zionist, but is far more skeptical about the moral legitimacy of the choices that a state needs to make. Make two last comments, then I'll turn it over to you, Micha. The first is, I've been trying to think in retrospect about whether there would have been any version of the Hasmonean state that the rabbis would have liked. The rabbis, Chazal of antiquity, detested the Hasmoneans, and they detested them precisely for this reason. Hasmoneans did great things for the Jewish people in the second century BCE, in the revolt against the Syrian Greeks. They enshrine political sovereignty in the land of Israel, build a Jewish nation in the homeland, but they ultimately become terrible. And it's not because they didn't welcome the original elements of nationalism that made the revolt possible, but because they hated the way that nationalism distorted the national interests of the Jewish people. The final point I'll make, and to pull it together, the overwhelming majority of American Jews still identify as Zionist in one way or another, deeply connected to Israel. They consider a relationship to Israel a meaningful part of their Jewish life, but they're pulling away from many of these aspects of the Israeli nation state. And I guess what I would say is, it seems, as strange as it sounds, American Jewish Zionism is more peoplehood than nationalism. And I believe actually morally that it should be cultivated that way. So let me turn it over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Yehuda. I have different feelings about nationalism. In 2006, I was with my wife in summer vacation in Switzerland. And we knew that there was a war beginning in Israel. And we went for vacation. And then Motzei Shabbat, right before we're going to hike in the Alps. So it wasn't a smartphone, it was 2006, I think it was a dumb phone. So I make a mistake of opening the phone, and here I have 106 new messages. And the first message is this: Huf'al giyus cherum, huf'al giyus cherum. So for the people watching us abroad, how do you say, emergency, you're recruited to the army. And message number 2, Huf'al giyus cherum. Message number, all through Shabbat, they were trying to get me. And only interrupted by, Micha, ifata, kulam kan. Micha, where are you? All the people in, how do you say miluim? All the reserves, they're already here. I'm like, oh no. And here I am. I look at my wife. She's packing to go hike in the Alps. And I'm like, how am I going to tell her? How am I going to tell her this? So there was a moment where I asked myself, maybe I should just, I didn't open the phone. But I realized, I'm going back home. So I go back to the airport, and, the hike is canceled. My wife's not very happy. Going back to the airport, you go through everything. You go through the airport in Geneva, and you go through the security. And I don't know why I decided to tell the people checking me up in security that I'm going back for the war. And they were so proud. They said, is there anything we can do for you? And I said, yes, maybe you could upgrade me on the... But they didn't. For some reason, their Zionism wasn't strong enough. And so anyway, I get back, and I felt so special that I left summer vacation, and I'm going home. And when I went up to the Golan Heights, where my unit was, I realized there were many other people that did this, and I wasn't special at all. And that was a moment I realized, wow, all these people left where they were and came. I'm not special. Something larger here is special. During 2006, there were families, many, many families, from the north that couldn't stay up north because they were bombed. So they went to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem, and families, I'm sure everyone here knows about this phenomenon. Maybe you're a part of that phenomenon. So they let Israeli families in their homes. Volunteers from Ein Prat went all the way up north to volunteer in bomb shelters. I remember in 2014 when we were in Sukkot Eitan, so I remember Me and some friends went to buy groceries for Shabbat in Sderot, and we saw there so many people from Yerushalayim, from Tel Aviv. They just went there to buy. They just went. I'm sharing these stories because we all know these stories to remind ourselves of something. Nationalism could bring the best out of us. Sensitivity, empathy, altruism, nationalism could bring the best out of us. I want to say that because we all know something else. Nationalism can bring the worst out of us. Racism, xenophobia, chauvinism. Now, this is something we have to recognize. Nationalism is great and nationalism is horrible. The question is, what kind of nationalism are we cultivating? Now, Hebrew makes our life easier when we think about nationalism. Because in Hebrew, we have a distinction between le'umiyut and le'omanut. In English, you don't have that distinction. But here's the way I try to understand the difference between what I will call good nationalism and what I want to call bad nationalism. And there's many philosophers that spoke about this, but I want to use a line by someone that's today affiliated with bad nationalism. Harav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the Rav Kook. And what he says is that what nationalism does to us, when we feel connected to the people we share a fate with, we share a destiny with, it helps us break our ego, escape ourselves, be connected to something bigger than ourselves. It doesn't come easy to Homo sapiens to do that. To Western people, it doesn't come easy to overcome our tendencies to preserve ourselves. And it breaks that, and you escape your ego. And you share. You can see the pain of others. And because it does that, what nationalism does, it trains that muscle of caring for others, of loving others. And then that emotion of love could break the boundaries of your nation and spill to other nations, spill onto all humanity. Rav Kook says once it does that and you train your muscle of love for all humanity, then it could spill onto all living beings. He says there's Shir Pashut, a simple song. That's the love of yourself, which is important because that's where you practice love. It spills over to your nation, which is important. That's where you practice to escape yourself. It spills over to humanity. It could spill over to all living, sentient beings. What is bad nationalism? Is when your love for your nation doesn't pave the way of your love to other nations, to other people, to other human beings, but it traps that love. It traps the solidarity within its boundaries. And you think the only way to express the love for your nation is through negation and rejection and sometimes hate for other nations. So does nationalism pave the way to universalism? Or does it block universal love? Now, since there is healthy nationalism and since there's distorted nationalism, I don't think the fact that there's distorted nationalism means we should reject nationalism. That would be like, lately, the past 2 years, you know this, Yehuda, I'm very interested in technology and the damages that's created by technology. People that use their smartphones more than 3 hours a day, their chance of being depressed is like up 30%, of cultivating empathy is down 40%. There's damage over usage of a technology. So I used to think maybe technology is bad, maybe we should reject technology. And I've softened up the past 2 years. I've softened up. Many people told me, Micha, you got this wrong. The fact that using technology too much doesn't mean technology is bad. What does it mean? We're using it too much. An overdose of technology is bad. Technology is not bad. An overdose of nationalism is bad. Nationalism is not bad. By the way, fundamentalism is a distorted version of religion. And some people here in Israel think that because you have a distorted version of religion, we should reject religion altogether. And just like I don't want, because there's fundamentalism, to reject religion, because there's fascism, I don't want it to reject nationalism. And because there's addiction to technology, I don't want to reject technology. I think it's a false way of thinking, and this is the oldest trick of the book, by the way, to think about the worst form of a phenomena, the extreme, distorted form of a phenomena, and that creates an allergic reaction, and then you shift that reaction towards the phenomena itself. Yehuda, Otzma leIsrael is disgusting and we despise it. But it's very easy after we despise Otzma, a distorted version of nationalism, to shift that and despise nationalism. But since there's Chilul Hashem to religion, there's also Chilul Hashem to nationalism. Now, I think the better way would be not to reject nationalism, but to cure nationalism. How to cultivate the better nationalism. When it comes to technology, we have to learn how to use technology without being addicted by technology. When it comes to nationalism, we have to learn how the connection to a people could cultivate an emotion that could spill over to other people. When it comes to religion, religion can make us softer and more sensitive. It can also make us blind and dogmatic. By the way, any cultural phenomena has a dark side. Any one. Family has dark sides. Are we going to cancel family? So the fact that you expose a dark side in a phenomena doesn't mean that now you exposed that we have to reject a certain phenomenon. It means we have to work with it and cure it. And yes, Israel has problems. America doesn't have any problems. But Israel has problems. And we have to figure this out. But I think the role of nationalism to cure our egos and to cultivate a strong sense of universalism, that role is still the role of nationalism, even though we have today a lot of Chilul Hashem that's been done to nationalism. Yep.
Okay. Yehuda, you have a lot there on your plate to unpack from Micah as usual. Let's hear your response.
I mean, Micah, I want to ask you a couple of questions, which I don't think anything in which in that I said involves an argument that says, okay, nationalism, we got to get rid of it, abandon the nation state, move to a different mode, radical diasporism. I'm not making that kind of argument. What I'm arguing to is a little bit, I think, more subtle, which is that attitudes that the Jewish people have in America, which are oriented towards peoplehood and oriented towards Zionism, require a certain dose of what you called good nationalism, and they are experiencing a way in which Israeli expressions of nationalism are actually making those considerations and even that Zionism invisible. You know, there's a big generational divide in the American Jewish community among people who are critical of Israel. And I mean lovingly critical of Israel. The generational divide is between an older generation of Jews who are lovingly critical of Israel, but are so frustrated that their Jewishness in Israel is considered irrelevant, if sometimes discounted entirely through the instruments of state. And then the next generation are less concerned about issues of religion and state, Jewish and democratic, and much more concerned with issues of occupation. Let's focus on that older generation for a second. Their relationship to the nationalism of the state of Israel was in order to be the fulfillment of a vision of Jewish peoplehood. And they watch as the realpolitik calculations of an Israeli government systematically sidelines and obliterates how their deep passion of Jewish peoplehood is supposed to find a place in Israeli nationalism. It doesn't have a place. You know, part of my question, Micah, is not just can there be good nationalism? Great, I'm with you. What is the nature of the obligation of an Israeli nationalism that has to make realpolitik calculuses to seeing diaspora Jewish peoplehood within its field of view? And just to add to that, Micah, when you said, the idea of nationalism, a good nationalism, has a universalistic ethos to it. It's funny. It's almost like what you did was, here, us Israelis, good nationalism. Now, what should happen is now I have a field of view which incorporates all the other nations of the world. I'm not talking about the other nations of the world. I'm talking about me. Like there's a step in between the Israelis and the Chinese people. And it's diaspora Jewry that's attached to Jewish peoplehood. And I actually am fearful that a commitment to nationalism in some ways in displacing peoplehood winds up basically saying, I'm more interested in building relationships with India and China than I am with liberal Jews in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Topeka.
Okay, these are two important questions. I'll address the second one first.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think in Israel we have a problem, and that is that our sense of connection to the nation helps us forget that there are other Jews in the world. I think that's true. There's obviously a lot of paradox here. Because Israel wasn't created by Israelis for Israelis. It was created by the Jews for the Jews. It's a project of the Jewish people for the Jewish people. That's how I understand Zionism. And then something happened. In order to create Israel, a lot of solidarity, Jewish solidarity, that creates the will that enabled us, the founding fathers, to build the country, to build the state. So Jewish solidarity creates a state, and then that solidarity is trapped within the boundaries of the state. And I think you're right when you're talking about the older generation. There is an asymmetric relationship between American Jews and Israeli Jews, where American Jews are very curious about Israeli Jews. They read about Israeli Jews. They read books written by Israeli Jews, thank God. The news, like they're in. Israeli Jews are not curious about American Jews. You're right, Yehuda. It's like there's an asymmetry in the relationship. I tell my Israeli students, thank God there's going to be a symmetric relationship. But sadly, it's not because Israelis are becoming curious about American Jews. But it's because it seems like more and more American Jews are becoming less curious about Israel. That's the tragedy, is that we can have a symmetric relationship. So I completely agree with that critique. And how can the Jewish state, created by a sense of Jewish peoplehood, stop blocking that sense of Jewish people? That's a big question. I share that question. I share that critique. It's going to be a very big challenge on many, many levels. In 2014, I forgot his name, the commander of the Golani Brigade was a Israeli, he was a Druze. Was it Faris, I think his name was? Anybody remember? And I remember I was in New York, and there was a moment where I asked, wow, I feel connected to them because they're Jews. The commander of Golani is now risking his life to save the life of, to protect the nation state in Gaza, and I felt like, wow, so Israel is creating a serious dilemma. Who you connected more? The people who share the same language, destiny, and space, or the people who share the same culture, religion, and past? It's creating a dilemma. I admit, it really is creating, it's an issue. And how can we, I don't think, it's not either or. I think there should be serious solidarity between all Israelis, including non-Jewish Israelis, and solidarity between all the Jews in the world, including the Jews who are not in Israel. But this is a big challenge. It's a very big challenge. So I'm completely with you. I don't know what the answer to this question is, though, because my attempts here in Israel to try to cultivate solidarity that goes beyond the boundaries of Israel always failed. So I'm sure later on we're going to open this up to the crowd. There's some young people. I would like to hear other people, the way Israelis think about this. But so that's now regarding your first question, which was, what was your first question, Yehuda?
I think I asked you how this obligates you. I think you answered that a little bit, but it relates to the India-China piece of like why the skipping over some ways.
No. I remember. The whole realpolitik thing. This is tough. It's true that it's a lot easier to be an idealist when you don't have power and you have to implement those ideals. Now, in this sense, Echad Ha'am has a great observation. Echad Ha'am wrote an article about Moshe. And he asks, he has a midrash here where he argues that Moshe resembles justice, pure justice. He's a fighter for justice. He can't compromise at all when it comes to his ideals. So Echad Ha'am says that is why he couldn't cross the Jordan River and couldn't enter Israel. Because crossing the Jordan River, entering Israel, by definition means compromising your ideals. Because any attempt, anytime we do things, I'm sure you as you're running a very large and successful institution, I'm sure sometimes you have to compromise what you believe in, right? So now you take national ideals and you have to build the nation state. We compromise every day. Every day. According to the Midrash, the Malachei HaSharet told God never to create a human being because he'll always have to compromise the ideals. But God said, yes, I want human beings because we need the ones who, well, life is about constant compromise. And maybe we're compromising too much. Maybe we're making compromises that we shouldn't be. But I think, it's my position, that you're only ethical when it's possible to be unethical. I'll say that again. You could only become ethical if it's possible to be unethical. Because only if you could fail ethically, you could succeed ethically. And it's true, when people have power, power could corrupt. And when you have power, so you're tested. And how are you tested? How do you treat people that are powerless? But it's very easy to preach, to be sensitive towards people that are powerless when you don't have power. You're only tested. And because you can fail, that's why you can succeed. So I think the Israeli project, Dafka Yuda, because I don't deny that it could fail. I think because of that, it's our only chance to see if the values of our Torah could work in this world.
Let me try one more round, Micha, if that's okay. And then I know we want to open it up to the folks who are there and online. You know, it's interesting when you started off, you talked about the moments of solidarity that you felt with other Israelis had to do with being called to service and called to action by some hybrid between the government and the military. And let's acknowledge, even in that context, that there are some times when governments and militaries do things that are in clearly the undisputed national interest of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And there are times when they don't, when they do things because they have political calculuses, and even the language of security oftentimes has a strong political valence. It's a key feature of the election. You know, one of the things that I have come to believe about Jewish peoplehood is that Jewish peoplehood made the Jewish people more committed to solidarity to one another than ever being willing to really trust governments. In other words, that was a survival tool for the Jewish people throughout history. Don't trust the government, trust solidarity in Jewish peoplehood. I guess in some ways, what I'm thinking about as a diaspora Jew who very much identifies as a Zionist and is in relationship to Israel every day and all the time, is that the way in which to square this peoplehood nationalism piece I would like to see Israelis, and I know Israelis are not big fans of their government in general. I would like to see a deeper detachment between the nationalism that you're talking about and the particular directives and discourses that are connected to the governments, to the structure of nationalism. Just to be cute, like I would like to move away for American Jews talking about themselves as being pro-Israel, and instead be pro-Israeli. Because pro-Israeli is like, I'm in relation, it's me with you. That's Jewish peoplehood, and there's a version of nationalism that lives in the phraseology of being Israeli, but it doesn't require me, it doesn't demand of me to be in any sort of commanded or obligated relationship with government structures that I think are going way too far, on your realpolitik argument, I think you're right. Governments have to do that. But I don't want to allow Jewish peoplehood to be savaged by those realpolitik considerations. That's what nationalism has to do. But God help us if that's what peoplehood becomes.
Yes. So again, I agree with you on this completely. I think a very strong distinction should always be made between government and nation. I think a healthy nation should be very critical of their government. And if you're critical of your government...
But God help.
Are we good? Yeah. If you're critical of your government, and even if you could despise your government, that doesn't mean you don't love your people. And this is something that that sometimes Israelis don't get and Americans don't get. Some American Jews today, the younger generation, think that the fact that they despise Israeli governments and their policies, it translates psychologically somehow to a rejection of Israel as a whole. Sometimes they can't make a distinction sometimes between the government and the people. Sometimes Israelis think that patriotism means to be a fan of the government. No, that's not patriotism. That's not nationalism. Yes, Ahavat Israel is not Ahavat Memshelet Israel. Yes, and by the way, we come from a tradition that we realize that power is important, but you should never glorify power. Yes, King David is admired because of the way he used power. But then he couldn't build Beit HaMikdash. Why couldn't he build Beit HaMikdash? Because you can't glorify such use of... We need David, but we can't glorify that usage of power. But as you know, I mean, anybody that knows Israelis know that Israelis can be at the same time extremely critical of their government and at the same time very patriotic. The problem is that when we confuse the two, it turns people either... The only expression of patriotism is being a fan of the government. That's one, let's call that unhealthy nationalism. And the second option is because I despise the governments, I feel uncomfortable with the nation altogether. And obviously, I'm with you. I think we should have a strong sense of solidarity. And we should take government for what it is. It's organized power, and sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's bad. We should have a critical conversation. But you know how I know that in Israel we have a critical conversation? A real, open, critical conversation about power and about politics. The reason I know that we have, this is an observation of Natan Sharansky. The reason I know in Israel we're an open society is because I read that Israel is not an open society in an Israeli newspaper. And as long as I read in an Israeli newspaper, and anyone that wrote it is not afraid to write that, and that they write that we're not an open society, that's the indication that we are an open society. If we won't hear in Israeli public space that we're not an open society, then we'll know that we're not an open society yet anymore. But we all know Israel. In Israel, people are not afraid to say that Israel is not open, which is so far is a good, healthy testimony that people are not afraid to speak out and that we could feel connected to each other without always worshiping government.
Thanks Yehuda and Micah, we're going to open the program to questions. We have a few already from our online listeners. If anybody in the room wants to ask a question, there's a microphone here on my left, your right. So if you want to ask a question, please line up at the microphone, and I'll ask you to give your name and to state your question as a question. As much as we want to hear from all of you, we don't really want more speeches. So while you line up here, anybody here, I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and ask a question first to Yehuda. Yehuda, I was in New York on election day 2016, and the next day I heard you speak at the Congregation B'nai Jeshurun about how the election had kind of shaken your deep faith in the United States. And you also said this evening that 1967 was a time that didn't necessarily produce a mass emigration of American Jews to Israel, but rather a strengthening of American Jews to stand up and be who they really wanted to be. I'm wondering now, in 2019, if the current political situation in Israel and in the United States is in fact turning that upside down, that there's more fear or concern, and there's less strengthening, both because of American nationalism and the rise of Israeli nationalism?
Thanks, Alan. Look, I think as I experience my and the Jewish community's relationship to our political structures, whether it's relationship to America or relationship to Israel, I think we hold in relationship to our political structures on the basis of a calculus of does the narrative that I have told about this place for a long time still hold true? And does this place, is this place acting in ways that are consistent to my values? I think the reason why American Jews have thrived in America for so long is that American Jews have found a way to formulate a narrative of America that's consistent with what they think about Jewish values, and have also curated their Jewish values to fit with an American narrative, right? So for instance, it's not a coincidence that American Jews love the terminology of tikkun olam. It's an exceptionalist discourse that works really well as an American Jew living in the context of American exceptionalism. American Jews have also told a story about America, that America is open to immigrants, available to opportunity, that you can rise through the system. We know that that's not true for everybody, but it certainly was true for the majority of American Jews in the 20th century. And so we've curated a good story about what the place represents and what are our values that make us capable of thriving in that place. I think that American Jews related to Israel in many ways through the same piece. Is the story that they liked about Israel was a story of the Jewish people makes good, a story of a country whose value system was utopian in a lot of ways. I think that what American Jews, especially liberal American Jews, are experiencing in the last couple of years is what happens when my values are disconnecting with the American story. What I tried to share at BJ on the election night was, I think American Jews waking up to the election of Donald Trump felt, wait a second, what if America is not what I thought it was? Now here I'm stuck with this value system and it's not consistent with this narrative, and then you experience this powerful cognitive dissonance which alters your politics. I think that's very true for many American Jews in relationship to Israel also. Do I change my values in order to understand Israel? Which people generally don't do, or do I confront the fact that the narrative of Israel is just inconsistent with my values? I think that's what we're talking about, is that kind of existential discomfort. Now, it's not true for all Jews. Obviously, there are critical mass of American and Israeli Jews who are pro-Netanyahu and pro-Trump and actually feel for the first time, look, these stories are now more unified than they were ever before because my narrative about both countries and my value systems are now being brought together. But I think I think what you've described is basically the core educational challenge. If I feel as though a story of a country is disappearing from me and I still have this set of values, what do I need to do either politically to engineer a different story in that country, or educationally to alter my value system such that I can still be in relationship between one and the other? I think that is harder to do than we even think.
Micah, you also travel in the United States. So obviously you get at it from a different perspective, but you also have some American roots. How have you seen American Jews reacting in the last 2 years to the rise of nationalism and as Yehuda talked about, the realpolitik of making deals with people that you really wouldn't want to break bread with, but for realpolitik we have to, both in the United States and in Europe. How are American Jews, what are they telling you?
So here's another distinction I think we should make, and I think some American Jews have a hard time making this distinction. Well, the first distinction I want to offer is between good nationalism and bad nationalism. The second is between the government and the people. What you feel towards the government what you feel towards bad nationalism doesn't mean what you feel about nationalism. What you feel towards the government doesn't mean what you feel towards the people. And here's another distinction. What you feel, if Donald Trump sees himself as a person that supports Israel, if he likes Israel, and you hate Donald Trump, that doesn't mean you have to hate Israel. Your emotions, the connection between Trump and Israel, create a whole psychological system where your negative emotions towards Trump spilled over to Israel. Just like we feel that bad nationalism doesn't make you what you feel about nationalism, government doesn't have to spill over people. What you feel about Trump doesn't have to spill over to Israel, but it does. I see it does. I see it does. And one of the reasons why we have a hard time making distinctions between nationalism, between government and people, between Trump and Israel, is because the language, our political language, is being very scrawny, very limited. It lacks distinctions. It lacks nuances. It lacks your ability to say, Trump likes Israel, but let's anyway, we hate Trump, but let's again rethink what we think about Israel. And it's because one of the reasons why our political language is becoming very thin is because it immigrated to social media. And in social media, any argument that has nuance doesn't go viral. Any argument that has two sides to it is not a charismatic argument. And this is, by the way, what sadly Donald Trump taught us, is that the more harsh you are, the more simple you are, the more personal you are, the more viable you get. And if you have nuance, and if there's an argument, and if there's on the one side and on the other side, it's boring, it doesn't go value. We need that kind of a conversation, though, about Israel. We need a conversation where there's nuance, where there's one side and the other side. And social media is not friendly for the kind of conversation that we need to have.
Micah, I'm sorry, I can't resist. I have to push back.
Yeah, go for it. Go, Yehuda, go.
I think there's a sleight of hand there, Micah. It's not that, he likes Israel and therefore I don't like Israel. It's more subtle than that. It's I don't like the Israel that he likes. And therefore I'm angry that Israelis like him because I think he's dangerous for America. So that's more complicated, Micah. It's not just because he likes it, I detest it. That's easy.
No. There's an Israeli government that likes Trump, so it's a double distinction, right? You like Trump, you hate Trump, that's in cahoots with an Israeli government that likes him. And what you think of, so you hate the government, and since you hate the Israeli government, so you hate the nation. But the government is not the nation, and Trump is not the government, and there's distinctions. I'm just saying we have to be more subtle here. There's distinctions we have to make. And I just want to tell Yehuda one more thing, if I can. What we see throughout the world, and this is partially a result of political conversation immigrating to social media, is that extremism is highly rewarded politically these days. And this wasn't this way before. It always used to be that in order to win an election, you have to go to the center. Now, all over the world, people are going either to the right or to the left. And now it's feeding each other. When people go to the extreme right, the reaction, like we saw in England, like we're seeing in America today, the reaction is extreme left. I want you to notice, Yehuda, something interesting happening in these elections in Israel. That the reaction to extremism on the right is not left-wing extremism. It's the emergence of a centrist party. And in that sense, Israel, I don't know who will win these elections. I just want to notice a phenomenon which is different. That all over the world, yes, people react to extreme with extreme. In Israel, it seems like many Israelis are reacting to extremism with being moderate. And this is very interesting. Maybe this is what it means to be a startup nation. That we're reacting differently to extremism. So there's a different story here. You have to say something about Israelis, that they decided that they're reacting to extreme political rhetoric, not with alternative extreme political rhetoric, but trying to think that through a different lens. Maybe the alternative to extremism is pragmatism and not a different form of extremism. Yeah. And that's interesting, right? Yeah. That's interesting.
I wondered how long it would take us to get to the elections. Okay, so we're going to take 2 questions from the audience before we have our panelists respond. As I remind you again, give us your name, where you live, and a question, not a statement, please.
Yes, Aaron Bronstein of the Jewish Covenant Alliance. First, thank you on this good and bad nationalism. It's like healthy growth of cells versus cancer. And cancer leads to death. So it's another metaphor that can serve us very well. I'd like your view on the following proposition, that in addition to the wonderful paradigm of moral light to the nations, there's another paradigm, in addition to that one, that can unite the Jewish people around the entire world. And that's the paradigm that Abraham started with his struggle against evil idolatry in the world, Sodom and Gomorrah, and to realize now that we're facing totalitarian idolatry that puts religion above God. I'd like your comment on that we can unite and not have to think everything in terms of morality as the Jewish mission or the Jewish light to the world. There are other things happening in the world on the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Eve Fleischer, and I live in Jerusalem. And my question is for Dr. Goodman. In relation to the current elections, I would like to know his thoughts on where the national religious community, which certainly isn't, there are many views, but I'd like to know whether he feels that any significant portion of that community would choose to move to the center rather than supporting either the Jewish Home Party, which has made an alliance with Otzma Yehudit, the Kahanist, very extreme party, which Bibi Netanyahu went out of his way. I'm sorry, because there may be people listening from abroad who don't know the situation. But Bibi, anyway, everybody knows the story. Okay, so just, do you think that any significant portion of them will move to the center, or will basically they be choosing either Jewish Home Party or the new right of Ayelet Shaked and...
Okay, thank you. Yehuda, you want to take the second one first? Or you want to, Micah, you want to talk about politics for a minute, or should we talk about the other question first?
I'll start with Abraham. Yeah. So, a very interesting question about the legacy of Avraham Avinu and the blessing of God to Avraham Avinu. So, it's very interesting. God reveals himself to Abraham 7 times. Now, the first time he says to him, the first time he says to him, "V'nitbaruchu bezaracha." No, "V'nitbaruchu becha kol mishpachot ha'adama." I don't know how to translate it. It's such powerful and beautiful biblical Hebrew. "V'nitbaruchu becha kol mishpachot ha'adama." That you will be a blessing to all the families of earth, which he means to all nations of the world. By the way, this is after that the world is divided into nations, into families, the birth of nationalism, if you want. And he says to Abraham, he'll be a blessing not through canceling national divides, but it'll be a blessing to all nations. The second revelation, he says to him, Lecha eten et haaretz hazot. Okay, so he has now 2 revelations. One universal, the second territorial. And then throughout his life, he's going to get a universal revelation. He'll say, and then so he'll go on bouncing from the universal to the particular until the moment of the Akedah. In the Akedah, after the binding of Yitzchak, in the second revelation, the Malach, the angel, says to Avraham, first he says to him, Yirash zar'echa et sha'ar oivav, which is very national. You'll have military victory. And then he says, V'nitbaruchu bezaracha kol goyei haaretz. So now, here's a problem that I have. The 2 blessings of Abraham never really work together. The feeling that this nation is yours, that you're proud of it, that the land is yours on the one hand, on the other hand, that you have a real moral obligation to all of humanity. Here's a problem. I just want to put out the problem. How do you unite the 2 sides of the blessings of Abraham? Most of my friends that feel sensitivity to all human beings are embarrassed of nationalism. Most of my friends that are proud patriots don't feel like we have the privilege to have sensitivity to minorities and to other nations. There was one of the founding fathers of Zionism tried to put this together. His name was Ze'ev Jabotinsky. He was a territorial maximalist on the one hand, and he was a liberal on the other hand. Equal rights for everyone. Jabotinsky tried to put it together. By the way, Menachem Begin also tried to put it together. We live in a generation where both sides of the blessings of Abraham became two camps. The camp of sensitivity to all human people, all human beings, and the camp of nationalism. And I think the blessing of Abraham is a challenge to his descendants. How can we put the blessing together again? Both sides of the blessing. That is a great challenge. And the problem is that it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. And complicated arguments aren't usually heard on social media. They're heard like this. When we're face to face, things become complicated again. This is how we should be doing politics.
Yehuda, is it possible to put them together?
I want to riff on Avraham apropos your comments. You know, it's one of the things I find most amazing about Sefer Bereshit is that the Torah could plausibly end in Genesis 12, chapter 9. Abraham gets called, come to the land of Israel. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. You will be a blessing, etc. He wanders around the land, gets a sense of it. He builds an altar to God, and he settles. And then you get Genesis 12:10, which says what? Vayira'av ba'aretz. There's a famine in the land, and he has to leave. This is unbelievably strange theologically, that God actually calls him to this land, but makes it uninhabitable, and doesn't get angry at Abraham for leaving. In other words, God hasn't actually created the conditions for Abraham to stay in the land. So in addition to your dichotomy in terms of the universal and the particular, is also this constant tension of whether the promise that your people is going to be in this land is ever imagined to be an indefinite promise. And this is, I think, the category error that Zionism makes, which is it largely believes that it is the end of Jewish history, that the Jews are going to return from diaspora and be in the land of Israel. And you know, it's amazing. If you do the math, Jews have lived in Egypt far longer in our history than we've lived in the land of Israel. It's not just the time in not just it's not just the slavery period. From the 4th century BCE, while there's still second temple is standing, Jews find their way to Egypt as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Egypt is like a magnet and a metaphor for the Jewish diasporic experience. And in total, we've lived in Egypt far longer than we've ever lived in composite land of Israel. But only Zionism comes along and says, our return to the land means the delegitimization of all the possibilities of diaspora. So in addition to that tension, embedded in the story of Jewish peoplehood from the outset is not just the manifest destiny that you talked about, which is, you know, Zaracha, your children will inherit this earth, but they will inherit this earth and they might still not come. And until Zionism figures out that it can have a plausible narrative of Jewish nationalism in the homeland, but it's got to figure out how to be in relationship with the Philos of Alexandria and the Maimonides of Fustat and all of the other historical Jews of Egypt who represent a lot of the story of Jewish peoplehood, it's also going to continue to be too much of a monolithic misunderstanding, I think, of even its core foundations.
Thank you. I want to use what Yehuda said. I find it very interesting. I find profound what he said to answer the second question about religious Zionism. Like a darshan, you know, you connect everything, you know. It's all connected. It's a gematria. The way so Abraham comes to Eretz Yisrael, God says to him, Lecha eten haaretz hazot, and then there's famine, so he leaves, which proves that Avraham didn't think that the promise is a mitzvah. And there's a distinction many times we fail to make. Biblical promises aren't biblical mitzvot. Right. And by the way, I think many times religious Zionism doesn't make this distinction. It sees the fact that this land was promised to us as if now we have a mitzvah to own all the land. By the way, if a promise is a mitzvah, we're also commanded to make peace, because it says, "V'natati shalom ba'aretz." No, it's a promise. It's not a mitzvah. And we're also commanded to be prosperous, because it says, or to cancel wicked animals, because it says, "V'ishbati chaya ra'a min haaretz." what God promises you doesn't mean it's your obligation to fulfill. It's God's, and that's how Abraham understood it, because God promised you this land, but now I can't stay here because there's famine. So I think that's I think this is many times religious Zionists don't make a distinction between havtacha v'mitzvah. There are different categories, which takes me to religious Zionism, the important question about religious Zionism. Here's something a good friend of mine, Shmuel Rosnell, which is also an editor of my books in Hebrew, just wrote an amazing book called Yahadut Israelit. And this is kind of like, he wrote this with Camille Fuchs, and which it gathers a lot of deep polling about Israelis. You would say it's like the Israeli Pew Report. In 2013, there was a Pew Report about American Jews, which everybody very, very talking about it all the time. So here's the Israeli Pew Report, and one of the things that it does, it tries to understand religious Zionism, and the argument of this book is that we shouldn't be speaking about religious Zionism. We should be speaking about religious Zionisms. It's not one group anymore. It's at least two. And I think you're going to see in the following elections, and by the way, the political landscape shows that also. The fact that Naftali Bennett left Baita Yehudi, that's a split that reflects a split within religious Zionism. But the fact that every serious party has religious Zionist candidates, that today that includes Labor, with a graduate of Hartman School, our good friend, Yaya Fink, yes, as number, I forgot, but he was very successful in Labor. And in Kachol Lavan, you have Chili Tropper and Yoaz and Tehila and Alisa. You have all the whole neighborhood is now in Kachol Lavan, right? Yeah, and you have, it's because that represents the fact that you're going to have a very, very diverse vote of religious Zionists, and that shows, it's a political reflection of the fact that religious Zionism today has went through a serious process of privatization, where there's religious Zionisms, it's not one homogeneous group like it used to be in the 70s, 80s, and maybe even 90s.
Thanks, Micha. Speaking of Shmuel Rosner, his brother and his sister are on a panel in another room right now. So he he may be watching us, or he may be watching later on his own family in the program tonight. So let me take a few questions from our online readers, and pardon me for reading it on the phone, but it is 2019. We have smartphones now. And from Norm Markle, I'll take two questions as we did before. From Norm Markle, I think this is a good segue to what you just said, because he asks, where does Achad Ha'am's cultural Zionism fit into this discussion? And the second question is, let's see. Here we go. The second question is there a way to bridge this is from Rabbi Joshua Ratner. I'm not sure where he's from, but you guys may know him. Is there a way to bridge this de facto status of competing notions of covenant and breed, or does each one, by definition of being a breed, suck out sufficient oxygen for the other to thrive? For American Jews, bein Adam lechavero, Peoplehood, versus for Israelis, bein Adam lemakom, nationalism. Again, this is getting back to our original conversation. And finally, we'll leave it at that for now. Let's take the cultural Zionism, and is there any way to bring these two together?
So maybe I'll answer the cultural Zionism, and I'll leave you the...
I want to just say a brief word on Achad Ha'am, if that's okay.
Okay, go for it.
I think the thing to read on Achad Ha'am is his speech to the Zionist Congress in 1897, where he makes exactly the point that I was trying to make earlier, but more eloquently and at a more timely moment in Jewish history. Where Achad Ha'am says exactly this: the secret of our people's persistence was that it never worshipped material power, it only worshipped spiritual power. And the classic mistake that many of our political leaders have always made is the belief that in the alternative of worshiping the power that they have at their disposal. Achad Ha'am talks about how and here, this is, I am in this tradition. He's not trying to argue against the legitimacy of a Jewish nation state, the revival of Jewish nationalism, and why it's an essential solution to a particular political problem. But the argument he's trying to make is you're going to be seduced to think that the solution to your political problem is actually the solution to your existential problem. And that mistake results in its own idolatry. The idolatry of the state is actually the great tragedy that Echad Ha'am is seeking to avoid. And he goes on to talk about our politicians are just like any other politicians. And ultimately, as he goes on to say, you're going to wind up with just a Jewish a state like everybody else, but with people of the Jewish persuasion. So I think cultural Zionism is not meant to be a radical rejection of political Zionism. It's meant to be an acknowledgement that politics create the instrument by which the Jewish people can return effectively to history, but it doesn't obliterate all of what's at the core. What's extraordinary is that Echad Ha'am gets echoed by multiple prophets throughout the 20th century. Rosenzweig says the same thing about Zionism. He says Zionism is a diagnostician of genius, but a most mediocre healer. It recognizes the symptom, but prescribes the wrong total solution. Hannah Arendt makes the same argument. There's a consistent thread of it's okay to have the instrument of the nation state, but never become seduced into believing that the nation state is the total solution to what the Jewish people are supposed to offer to the world. So I think Echad Ha'am is very useful antecedent to this conversation.
No, I agree with what he said. But let me just say...
That kind of caught me by surprise, but...
And I agree. No, there's reading of Echad Ha'am, and I agree that just the fact that we're always seduced to worship something that makes us feel good, right? And that is avodah zarah, that is idolatry. So worship of technology is a good example. Technology is an instrument, and you could worship the instrument. Politics is an instrument, and you could worship the instrument. Israeli government is an instrument. You always worship the instrument. And Echad Ha'am, yes, I agree with you. Echad Ha'am did not deny political, although there is a radical reading of Echad Ha'am where he denied political Zionism, but he thought we should remember the limitations of politics, and that Zionism is supposed to be much more than just about politics. But one more thing about Echad Ha'am. Cultural Zionism meant for Echad Ha'am that here in Israel we'll create an amazing new, revived Jewish culture based on Hebrew. And that as opposed to, let's say, Ben Gurion Zionism, that we will be an Or LaGoim, Echad Ha'am thought we will be Or LaYehudim. That Jews around the world will be able to be inspired by the kind of Judaism being created in Israel, and that will revive their Judaism too. There's only one problem. And I can't understand how Echad Ha'am didn't see this. I think in Israel today, we have a revival of Echad Ha'am. And Israeli culture is very impressive. On all levels, Israeli TV is interesting. Israeli books are interesting. Israeli music is amazing. Just listen to Evyatar Banai, to Ehud Banai, to Meir Banai, to anyone called Banai. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's multi-layered. When Ehud Banai sings, "Shani olech al begesher ha'alacha," ומחפש את דרך השלום. So many associations are awakened immediately. First of all, it's a daily experience of Israelis in a traffic jam in Tel Aviv. But it's also echoes that halacha is a derech. Is a gesher, it's a bridge. And when you stand on the bridge of the halacha, you search for the path that leads to shalom, to peace. It's multi-layered, it's Israeli, it's Jewish. This is culture at its best. But the problem is, American Jews around the world can't enjoy this culture because there's a language boundary. So Echad Ha'am was successful and a failure at the same time. It was successful creating an amazing, vibrant culture where in Israel, you don't need religion to feel Jewish. It's in the air, and it's through the Hebrew. The problem is, because of language boundaries, it's hard for the Jews of the world to be inspired and enjoy the fruits of a nation speaking Hebrew, creating in Hebrew, and having a multi-generational dialogue in Hebrew.
That brings me to actually another question here from Gene Howard that maybe Yehuda can touch, because I know you've talked about this kind of issue before, especially with Hebrew. It says the question of connectivity of American Jews in Israel versus Israelis connectivity to other nations. American Jews teach that culture and history is our connection to Israel. Is there something that we can do better to teach our kids to be able to have solidarity with Israelis, that connectivity that Micah noted with the Druze, that the Jews have to the state, even as the shared history and experience between American Jews and Israelis diminishes? And this is, I think, touching on Micah's point and other things I know you've talked about in the past. Israeli to American Jew, not government to government or people to government, but what can break through this barrier, not acknowledging the language barrier?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it builds off of the question from Rabbi Ratner earlier that we didn't totally address, which is you have two different stories that are playing out here. And I think it simply goes back to something Micah said earlier, which is the way in which the Jewish people heal this rift is discursively, is interactively. I think you're right, Micah. The absence of the inability of American Jews to access this production of original Jewish culture in Hebrew is too bad. It's really disappointing. There's great stuff going on. And I don't think it's easily solved because it's not that American Jews can't learn Hebrew, it's just that they're Americans, and Americans are monolingual, like Bishita, against the rest of the world. And so it's unlikely that a major campaign to teach American Jews the kind of Hebrew they would need to know this stuff would work. But here you and I riffed for a few minutes about Avraham, and all in Avraham, embedded in this story, it's not just a shared history, a shared past, a shared text. It's actually this unbelievable repository of complex knowledge about this story of Jewish peoplehood. And when you put it that way, then it's like the idea that there's like trivial distinctions brought about by history between Jews in one part of the world and the other part of the world that make them reductive, narrower readers of that tradition is not just a betrayal of Jewish peoplehood, but it's like a savaging of the tradition itself. It's like, part of the discursive process between American Jews and Israeli Jews, which will have to happen in translation, is going to have to be through how are we both obligated by a much more complex story that we're both inheritors of, rather than simply becoming the caricatures of narrow expressions of those stories.
Amen. Amen.
Well, I think with that amen from Micah, we're going to wrap.
We share the dialogue in the same text, but they share the same language, so it was easier for them.
So we're going to try and share the same language of finishing at the same time as the other panels so that you can all have a break and anybody who wants to can attend the evening program. I want to thank Yehuda Kurtzer from New York, and especially for pushing through one or two technical difficulties at the beginning of the evening, and of course Micah Goodman, our good friend and partner here at the Institute. Thank you for being an excellent audience. And now is time for a break. And after the break is our David Hartman evening. I want to thank you again. And to all our online viewers, we're signing off for now. Take care, be well, and shalom from Jerusalem.